And before we cross over to Nyeri County, our reporter Clement Masombo will be on standby to update us on what is happening in that county. I'd like us to look at the impact of COVID-19. Of course, so many people are still wondering why we're still having the conversation around the COVID-19. But this is important because it has affected the country's economy, not only here in Kenya alone, but globally. To have this discussion with me on the pandemic severity which has affected the global supply chain, talking to John Karani, the chair of the Kenya Institute of Supply Management. Asante sana.
Thank you so much,
Good morning.
Brenda. Good morning to you.
Nice to have you here.
Nice to have you
KTN
too.
News Studios.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, we are talking about the impact of COVID-19,
yes,
Mr. Karani. So the pandemic severely affected the global supply chain. But when we look at Kenya, we draw it back, to Kenya so that the common man can understand.
Absolutely.
How has the Kenyan economy absorbed the supply chain shocks?
Yeah, so the way to look at it, of course, is that we don't exist in our own as a nation. So we exist in a community of nations. So by virtue of that very fact, we are affected by everything that goes on globally. Mm-hmm. So that ripple effect has completely hit us right up to your own jikoni, as it were, right up to the mama mboga.
Yeah.
And I suppose it comes from this aspect that Kenya is a net importer of many goods, especially things that are used for raw materials, production. We have not developed our own capacity and capability to create our own industries. So there are many ways that we've been affected, and I think for me the biggest one has been the supply chain. Supply chain has been the biggest impact. And I think for the very first time, COVID had an undesired effect, which was good for the supply chain people, because for the first time people got to know about supply chain. Supply chain is everything. Everything revolves around supply chain. So
in fact, I was about to ask you, if you can be wondering, when you talk about supply chain, what does it mean?
Okay.
So just break it down to the common man who wants to understand what the supply chain means. So
it all starts from the sourcing aspect, identifying let me tell you, the way when you look at a case study of a production place, for instance, a factory. A factory depends on raw materials. Raw materials have to be sourced from somewhere. Now, there's a place called China. China is supposedly the factory of the world. And we in Kenya literally source everything from finished goods to raw materials from China. Was before COVID. And I think that supply chain issue starts right from there, identifying the need. If you want to produce a good in Kenya, what do you need? You have to go the pipeline. It's a chain.
All right.
And identifying the need, identifying the source of that need, buying that need, transporting it. So logistics transportation is another part of supply chain. In some cases, warehousing it in inventory. That's another way of supply chain. And then production, and then finally distributing the final goods to the end consumer. Supply chain is only complete. It's an end-to-end process that starts from the sourcing all the way to your mama mboga or your kitchen table.
To when you find the consumer.
Exactly.
All right.
So that's supply chain.
At least now people understand what the supply chain is.
In simple terms.
Supply chain in simple terms.
Exactly.
But then, Mr. Karani, how much of the global, supply chain shocks is influencing the kind of inflation we are witnessing here in Kenya in terms of our country's economy? Because every time the government is talking about inflation rate.
So overnight, with these supply chain earthquakes that happened, which is really changed the whole landscape, people actually ran out of stock in some cases. So you have to think about more expensive sources of supply chain. So China itself, I think, got its own constrictions because they needed to meet their own demand, but more importantly, they were prioritizing first world countries. So we in Africa became literally a third, fourth, priority for them. What does that mean? We still had to create ways of ensuring the supply chain is still operating. What does that mean? We have to look for other sources, going to India, developing new sources. And then, as before COVID is over, you got what you call shipping line catastrophe, the container shortage. That supply chain, that's what I call logistics now. The shipping cost became longer, or the routings became longer, the cost became higher. And that ripple effect, by the time you finish, let's say oil, for instance, it may be cheap to get crude oil, but just getting it into Africa or into Kenya, getting a raw material cheaply maybe, but by the time you get it here, the shipping costs alone, I think double or triple in some cases. End result, costly cost of production, cost of goods became high. So the net effect of all that is that the overall goods that arrive here are much more expensive. At the same time, you got the depreciation of the shilling. All this combination of factors ended up making really the cost of living in Kenya and therefore inflation very high.
So, as a country, it was one way of trying to make the inflation rate not high. Is it possible, or rather, has Kenya reached that point whereby we can have our own supply chain instead of depending on countries like China?
And I think that's really the wake-up call of what COVID should have done for us. Are we able to go back into our supply chain and develop local capacity, local manufacturing capacity, instead of depending on imported finished goods, imported raw material, imported matchsticks, soaps, everything, you know. It's really sad to see that type of thing. So for me, the blessing that we should have had, the advantage we should have taken, and I think in many ways we have done that in terms of developing our own local industry, cottage industry. I always quote the case of South Korea. South Korea became an industrial nation out of a very strategic plan and very deliberated by the whole government support. South Korea, if you think about the goods that we have today, maybe the fridges, the cars, the phones that we all have, Samsung and all that, they all started as cottage industries in South Korea. But what did they do? They were intentional, they were deliberate in identifying the industries they wanted to support to make them a global superpower.
All right.
Now, we in Africa, and specifically in Kenya, have all it takes. These people in the West, they take raw material from us and convert it into finished goods. We must therefore develop the technical capacity. We may need to borrow in the beginning in terms of mechanism, production capacity, but we must eventually create value addition industries.
Right.
Exporting our tea, and I was very happy the other day to hear that we banned the export of tea, raw tea leaves. We can be the net exporter of tea, finished value added tea that actually will go to global. Today it's tea we export to the UK comes back to us 100 times of the price. What do? They just packaged it and call it Lipton or call it something else, but it's our tea from Kericho. And these are the things we must